The morning I found my husband's signed documents in the shredder was the morning I understood that what his family called love had always been a plan. The papers were half destroyed, curling at the edges, but the signature was still visible. Harold Mercer, his careful, slanted handwriting, and below it, a date from 3 weeks ago, a date when his son had told me Harold was too confused to handle any business matters at all. I stood in that big, quiet study with torn paper in my hands and felt the floor shift beneath me. Because if Harold had been lucid enough to sign documents 3 weeks ago, then the confusion his family kept describing was not coming from inside him. Someone was putting it there. Let me go back to where this began, because nothing about my life prepared me for any of it. My name is Ruth Calloway. I am 62 years old. I have brown eyes that have seen too much, hands that have kneaded bread dough for 40 years, and a heart that has been stretched so many times I stopped being surprised by what it could hold. I raised my daughter Claire in a rented house in Knoxville, Tennessee, just the two of us after her father passed. We were not poor exactly, but we were careful about the heat bill in January, careful about which cuts of meat to buy, careful in the way people are when there is no cushion beneath them. Claire was my whole world. She had her father's dark eyes and my stubbornness, which is saying something. She became a school teacher, which suited her perfectly. She loved those children with everything she had. Then 3 years ago, Claire got sick. It started as fatigue that would not lift, then joint pain, then the kind of tests that require specialist after specialist, until someone finally gives a name to what is taking pieces of you. The name they gave her was not kind. A severe autoimmune condition, rare enough that the only effective treatment was not covered by her insurance. The kind of treatment that costs more than I had earned in 20 years combined. I sold my house. I took every shift the bakery would give me. I called every number on every assistance program I could find. I sat at my kitchen table at 2 a.m. with spreadsheets and loan applications, and I still came up short. The night Claire called me crying and said she was thinking about stopping treatment, I went outside and sat on the steps of the apartment I had moved into after selling the house, and I prayed harder than I have ever prayed in my life. I told God I was not above begging. I told him I would do whatever it took. I did not imagine what the answer would look like. A woman I knew from church worked part-time for a companion care agency in Nashville. She called me one Thursday evening and said she had something unusual. A wealthy widower in the Texas Hill Country, 75 years old, was looking for a live-in companion. His family said he had been showing signs of early cognitive decline. The pay was generous, room and board included. I had never been to Texas. I had never done companion care professionally, but I said yes before she finished the sentence. Harold Mercer lived on a ranch property outside a small town called Fredericksburg, Texas, 2 hours from San Antonio. The land rolled in soft green hills, and the sky was the widest thing I had ever seen. The house was old limestone, the kind that had been added onto over generations, with a deep porch and ancient oak trees, throwing shade across the front. I expected to meet a confused old man. What I met instead was someone who shook my hand firmly and looked me directly in the eye and said, "They told me you were sensible." I hope that's true, because sensible is what I need. Harold Mercer had built a real estate company from one piece of land his father left him. He had 3 ranches, a portfolio of commercial properties across central Texas, and enough money that his children had never needed to work hard if they chose not to. He had been married for 40 years to a woman named Lorraine, and when she died 4 years ago, something inside him had gone quiet in a way it never fully recovered from. His son David managed parts of the business. His daughter-in-law Sandra organized the household calendars and the medical appointments. They were polished people who said the right things at the right times and whose eyes told a completely different story. In those first weeks, I watched Harold carefully. Yes, he repeated himself occasionally. Yes, he sometimes lost a word mid-sentence and had to reach for it. But he knew the names of every piece of land he owned. He knew his ranch hands by name and their children's names, and which pastures needed what work. He read the newspaper every morning and argued with the opinion section out loud. This was not a man losing his mind. This was a man being told he was. The doctor visits happened every 2 weeks. His son David always drove him, always sat in on the appointments, always summarized what the doctor had said afterward in ways that seemed just slightly off from what I had heard. "Dad had another episode of confusion this morning," David told the doctor once, about a morning when Harold had been sharp and funny and beaten me at cards. I mentioned it to Harold that evening. He looked at me for a moment. "David has been saying that for almost a year now. he said quietly. That I'm confused, that I'm not myself. He paused. Some days I believe him. Some days I'm not sure what I believe. That sentence stayed with me. I started paying closer attention to Harold's medication. He took several things, the way most men his age do: blood pressure, cholesterol, a few others. But there was one pill, a small white capsule, that he took every evening with dinner, something Sandra always prepared and set beside his plate personally. I asked the housekeeper Rosa about it one afternoon. She shrugged. Miss Sandra started that one about 8 months ago, Rosa said. She said the doctor prescribed it for his memory 8 months ago, right around the time the talk of confusion had started. I want to be honest with you. At that point, I did not want to believe what I was beginning to suspect, because believing it meant accepting that a son could do that to his own father, that a daughter-in-law could sit at the same dinner table, pour the same glass of water, and reach across with something that was quietly taking pieces of a man away. I told myself I was imagining things, and then Harold had a week of clarity unlike anything I had seen since arriving. Sandra had been out of town visiting her sister. David had been traveling for business. Rosa and I managed the household alone, and during that week Harold was more present, more himself, than he had been in all my months there. He told me stories about Lorraine that made me laugh until I cried. He called his attorney about a foundation he wanted to establish for agricultural scholarships. He talked about the future. The day David and Sandra returned, I watched Harold's eyes grow cloudy within 48 hours. The evening pill, Sandra, preparing it in the kitchen before dinner, her back always turned. I started pouring out the capsule when I could do it safely, replacing what I could with something harmless, watching, and Harold stayed clearer. Not perfectly clear, but there, he noticed too. Something feels different, he told me one morning on the porch. Different good or different bad? I asked. He looked out over his land for a long time. Like waking up, he said. That was when he asked me something I was not prepared for. Ruth, he said, I need to change my will. And I need to do it before David finds out, because if he finds out before it's done, I don't know what he'll do. He looked at me steadily. I want to fund that scholarship foundation properly. I want the ranch preserved, not sold off for development. And I don't want to die in a facility while my son manages the timeline. He let that sit between us. Will you help me? He asked. I looked at this man who had been kind to me every single day since I arrived, who asked about Claire every week, who had quietly arranged for a portion of my wages to go directly to her treatment fund without ever saying a word about it to me, until I found the bank statement by accident. Yes, I said, but we have to be careful. 2 weeks later, in a decision that shocked even me, Harold asked me to marry him. I know how that sounds. I knew how it sounded then. He was 75. I was 62. We had known each other for 5 months. I told him I was not the right person. I told him there were better options. He said, "You are the first person who has treated me like I still exist. That matters more to me right now than you understand." We were married in the living room of the ranch house on a Tuesday afternoon, with Rosa and the family attorney Mr. Elkins as witnesses. No announcement, no party. I wore a blue dress I had brought from Knoxville. David found out 3 days later. The change in him was immediate and complete. The polished manners thinned like paint on old wood. He came to the house that evening and stood in the kitchen doorway, while I was washing up after dinner. "You took advantage of a sick man," he said. I turned around and looked at him. "Your father is not a sick man. He has cognitive decline. It's documented. Documented by a doctor you drive to, in appointments you sit in on." He stepped closer. His voice stayed even. "You should think carefully about your position here, Ruth. You have no history with this family. No standing. Whatever he's told you, whatever he's promised you, it can all be challenged." I met his eyes. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact." Sandra said nothing. She stood behind her husband and watched me with the particular coldness of someone who has decided an obstacle needs to be removed. That night I sat beside Harold and told him everything. The pill I had been managing. The week of clarity. David's visit. Harold was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I was afraid to say it out loud, because saying it out loud meant accepting that my own son." He stopped. I kept making excuses. I kept thinking I was being uncharitable. "You were being a father," I said. He shook his head slowly. "A father who almost let them win." The next morning I called Mr. Elkins privately. He was a cautious man, practical, the kind of attorney who had survived decades in Texas business by never acting before he understood the full picture. I told him what I knew. He listened without interrupting. "Do you have the pill?" he asked. I had saved 2 capsules. I had been waiting. "Get them tested," he said, quietly. "I know someone." That same afternoon, I found the shredded documents. I was looking for a pen in Harold's study when I noticed the shredder basket had been emptied recently, but not fully. A sheet had caught in the mechanism. When I pulled it free, I saw the signature, Harold's name, dated 3 weeks ago, on what appeared to be a property transfer document. One of the smaller ranches, being transferred into a limited liability company with David's name on it. Harold had no memory of signing it. I photographed everything I could salvage. My hands were steady in a way that surprised me. I think when you have been frightened long enough, fear eventually resolves into something quieter and more useful. I put the photographs on my phone and the physical fragments in an envelope I hid inside my winter coat at the back of the closet. 3 days later, I was told I could no longer attend Harold's doctor appointments. David delivered this information at breakfast, calmly, as though he were discussing a schedule change. Harold's medical care was a family matter, he said. As the primary next of kin, he was restructuring the support arrangement. A professional nurse would be coming 3 days a week. My role would be reduced to household companionship. I looked at Harold across the table. His jaw was tight. "She is my wife," Harold said. "That marriage is being reviewed," David replied without blinking. "Given your documented condition and the circumstances, there are grounds to question your capacity at the time of consent." The room went very still. I understood then what was happening. They were not just trying to manage the money anymore. They were trying to erase me, erase the marriage, erase the changed will Harold and Mr. Elkins had quietly been preparing, erase everything that stood between them and everything Harold had built. That night I called Claire. She had been doing better. The treatment was working slowly, but it was working, and hearing her voice, steady and warm, reminded me why I had come to Texas in the first place. "Mom," she said when I finished telling her, "you already know what to do. You've always known what to do. You just needed to say it out loud." She was right. The next morning I did 3 things before anyone else in the house was awake. I sent the capsule photographs and the salvaged document fragments to Mr. Elkins. I wrote a detailed account of everything I had observed, dated and signed, and sent a copy to Mr. Elkins, and kept one myself. And I placed a call to the county sheriff's office, not to make an accusation but to ask a question. The kind of question an old woman asks when she is trying to understand what options exist. The deputy who answered was patient and clear. If someone was administering an unprescribed substance to an elderly person to impair their cognition, that was elder abuse. It was a felony. The bar for investigation was not a conviction. It was reasonable suspicion. I thanked him and hung up. That afternoon, the test results came back through Mr. Elkins. The capsules contained a sedative compound that had not been prescribed to Harold by any physician of record. It was not in any of the official medication documentation. It was being given to him, without his knowledge, and without medical oversight. Mr. Elkins called me within an hour. "Ruth," he said, "I've been Harold's attorney for 22 years. I've seen his family operate. I want you to know I am not surprised. And I want you to know that what you've done here is enough." David and Sandra arrived at the ranch that evening with a man I did not recognize, an attorney of their own with a slim briefcase and the kind of expression that meant he was being paid to be unpleasant. They had papers, an emergency petition for guardianship, claiming Harold was incapable of managing his own affairs or making competent decisions, including the decision to marry. Harold was sitting in the living room when they walked in. He looked at his son for a long moment. Then he said, "I've been waiting for this conversation for a while now." David's composure flickered for just a second. "Dad, this is for your own. Sit down," Harold said quietly. "All of you." Something in his voice made everyone sit. He looked at David. "I know about the transfers. I know about the capsules Sandra has been putting in my dinner for the better part of a year. I know about the doctor appointments where you spoke for me, described symptoms I didn't have, built a record you thought would protect you." He paused. "What I want to know is whether any part of you believed you were doing it for me, or whether it was always only about this land." David's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Sandra's attorney started to speak. Harold raised one hand and the man stopped. "Mr. Elkins is on his way," Harold said. "So are 2 officers from the county sheriff's department. I'd suggest your client reconsider his posture in the next few minutes." I sat across the room and watched the color drain from David's face. Sandra was the one who broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way of someone who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and finally sets it down whether they mean to or not. She pressed her hand over her mouth, her eyes filled. We were going to lose the development deal, she said. The ranch was the collateral. David needed it in his name to finalize the partnership, or the whole thing collapsed and we would have lost. She stopped. Lost what? Harold asked. Everything we'd borrowed against it, she whispered. The room was very quiet. David said nothing. He looked at his father. And whatever passed between them in that moment was something I looked away from, because some pain belongs only to the people inside it. The sheriff's deputies arrived 20 minutes later, followed by Mr. Elkins with a folder of documentation that took less time to present than I expected, because the truth, when it is supported by evidence, does not require much elaboration. David was taken in for questioning that evening regarding the forged property transfer and the unauthorized financial restructuring. Sandra was detained separately. The guardianship petition was never filed. In the weeks that followed, without the compound in his system, Harold recovered steadily, not to some impossible version of youth, but to himself. Clear, present, occasionally sharp, in ways that made Rosa laugh. He finished the charitable foundation paperwork. He updated his will under conditions that required a court-appointed independent assessor, not because it was legally required, but because Harold wanted no one to ever have grounds to question it. The development partnership David had borrowed against collapsed regardless. The debt was real, and the consequences were real, and Harold chose to let them be real, rather than protect his son from them. He arranged for legal counsel for David's case and paid for it, because he said a father does not stop being a father just because a son has done something wrong. But he did not rescue him from it. Claire flew to Texas for Christmas that year. It was the first time I had seen her in person since arriving, and when I met her at the airport, she was thinner than I remembered, but her eyes were clear and her hug was strong. She and Harold sat on the porch that first evening and talked for 2 hours while I watched from inside through the screen door. I do not know exactly what they said, but I heard Harold laugh twice, a real laugh, and I heard Claire's voice rise with something that sounded like relief. Later that night, Harold found me in the kitchen. "Your daughter," he said, "is remarkable." "She is," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then, I want to fully fund her treatment, not as part of any arrangement, just as someone who can, doing it for someone who deserves it." I started to say something about not needing charity. He stopped me. "Ruth," he said gently, "you walked into a house full of people trying to make me disappear, and you decided I was worth fighting for. You can let someone do something for you." I did not argue with that. I have thought a great deal about what I learned inside that limestone house in the Texas hills. I came there out of desperation, for my daughter, not for any noble reason. I married a man I barely knew because he asked me, and because I believed he deserved someone in his corner. I was not brave in any extraordinary way. I was simply paying attention when it would have been easier not to. The hardest part of the whole thing was not confronting David, or gathering evidence, or navigating the legal machinery. The hardest part was the earlier months, sitting at that dinner table while Sandra set the capsule beside Harold's glass, and telling myself I was not sure enough, that I might be wrong, that speaking too soon could make things worse. Those months cost Harold clarity he will never fully get back. I do not say that to make myself feel guilty. I say it because it is true, and because it is the thing I would change if I could. When something feels wrong, the cost of waiting to be certain is always paid by someone else. Claire is in remission. Her last scan was clean. She is back in her classroom in Knoxville, and I hear from her on Sundays, and she sounds like herself, which is the best sound in the world. Harold and I sit on the porch most evenings when the weather allows. He tells me about Lorraine sometimes, and I tell him about my years with Claire, and neither of us pretends that what we have is something it isn't. It is companionship and trust, and the particular tenderness that grows between people who have seen each other at their most frightened and stayed anyway. He called it the only kind of love that matters at our age. I think he is probably right. If this story reached something in you today, I would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you are sitting with something that feels wrong, something you keep talking yourself out of, something you keep waiting to be more certain about, I want to tell you what my daughter told me. You already know what to do. You just needed to say it out loud. Thank you for listening. I will be here next time with another story one, because there are always more of them, and some of them deserve to be told.